The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so, the kind of quiet that made the distant hoot of an owl feel like a warning. On a small, unassuming farm in rural Britain, Edward Bowen crouched behind a tangle of wires and wooden frames, his breath clouding in the cold air. The dim light of a lantern flickered across his face, illuminating sharp eyes that never seemed to rest. To anyone else, it would have looked like the work of a madman tinkering with strange radio equipment, twisting dials and scribbling indecipherable numbers in a notebook. But to Bowen, it was nothing short of thrilling. He adjusted a small transmitter, a device cobbled together from spare parts scavenged from old radios and factory scraps. Sparks leapt briefly from the connections, making him flinch, then he steadied his hands. A low hum filled the air, almost imperceptible, until he aimed the antenna skyward and held his breath, and then it happened. A faint, ghostly ping echoed through his receiver, a sound so subtle that Bowen could have imagined it. But it wasn't his imagination. A solitary aircraft cut through the night, its metal body reflecting the faint radio waves he had sent skyward. The signal bounced back. He froze, heart hammering in his chest. The tiny farm, the frozen crops, the stillness of the night, it all seemed to fade away. What he had stumbled upon was astonishing. The radio waves he had sent into the sky had returned, revealing the presence of something invisible in the darkness. Bowen's mind raced. If a simple aircraft could be detected this way, could it also work for the unknown? For the planes that Britain might soon face? The idea came unbidden. Startling in its audacity, a backyard trick could warn of approaching enemy aircraft, hours before any human observer might see them. A chill ran down his spine, half fear, half exhilaration. He realized in that quiet, electrified moment that he was holding the key to something far larger than himself, something that could change the course of the war. He leaned closer, adjusting the dials, watching the needles dance in response to invisible forces. Every ping of returning radio waves felt like a heartbeat, a whisper of possibility. The ordinary world of his farm, the chickens roosting in the coop, the wind rattling through the fence posts, was now entwined with an extraordinary purpose. Yet even in this moment of revelation, Bowen understood the weight of what he had discovered. He was a civilian, untested in the ways of military science, standing on the precipice of something monumental. The air seemed heavier, charged with the tension of the unknown. What he had found could save lives, or, if ignored, leave the nation vulnerable to the dark shadows flying across the English Channel. He scribbled furiously in his notebook, each line of calculation carrying the tremor of both fear and hope. Somewhere over the horizon, invisible threats loomed, and Bowen, in his quiet farm field, had just found a way to glimpse them. The night stretched on, silent but for the hum of his equipment. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves seemed to whisper a warning. And Edward Bowen knew, deep in his bones, that this was only the beginning. Edward Bowen had never been one to back down from a challenge, but nothing in his quiet farm experiments could have prepared him for the walls he now faced. He found himself in a stark, chilly office at the Air Ministry in London, far removed from the familiar smell of damp earth and freshly cut hay. Maps covered the walls, dotted with little pins marking airfields and radar stations. Yet the mood in the room was tense and unwelcoming. He adjusted his coat nervously and held tightly to his notebook, the pages brimming with sketches, calculations, and hastily scrawled observations from nights spent in the dark, listening to the invisible signals of the sky. The officials before him were stern men in crisp uniforms, faces set in expressions of polite but firm skepticism. "So you're telling me," one of them began, voice sharp, that a civilian, working in his backyard, can somehow detect aircraft before they arrive? "Yes, sir," Bowen replied, trying to steady his own wavering confidence. "The radio waves, when they bounce off a metal object like a plane, they return. And by measuring that return, we can tell how far away the aircraft is? It's basic physics." A snort of disbelief rippled around the room. "Physics doesn't win wars, Mr. Bowen," another officer said, tapping his fingers on the desk. "We have observers, spotters, and intelligence. What you're proposing sounds impossible." Bowen felt a flicker of frustration but forced himself to remain calm. He knew the truth of what he had seen that night on his farm, the way the signal had returned, unmistakable and alive. Yet he also knew that belief alone would not convince these men. They wanted proof, not theory. They wanted certainty in a time of uncertainty, a luxury he could not provide. Yet, over the following weeks, Bowen returned again and again, each time bringing more data, more sketches, and more equipment. He demonstrated the experiments in controlled environments, showing how the reflected waves moved when a plane passed overhead. But still, the skepticism lingered. The officers would lean back in their chairs, arms crossed, and shake their heads as though the very idea of a civilian contributing to national defense were preposterous. It was not just doubt that Bowen faced. It was the weight of the stakes. Britain was exposed. Across the Channel, the Nazi war machine was growing bolder, their bombers already testing the defenses of coastal towns. Every day that passed without a way to detect incoming threats meant more risk, more potential loss of life. Bowen felt that burden keenly, like a stone pressing against his chest. Each dismissed presentation, each skeptical glance was a reminder that time was running out. He refused to give in. In quiet moments, Bowen would retreat to the basement of the ministry or to a nearby workshop, recalculating, adjusting, improving. He experimented with different frequencies, antenna designs, and receiver sensitivity, sometimes working through the night until his eyes burned and his fingers cramped. The theory became practice, the backyard trick evolving into a prototype that could no longer be ignored. Then came the breakthrough moment. During a demonstration with a small aircraft flown overhead, the receiver picked up a signal, a clear, unmistakable return. Bowen's heart pounded as he watched the oscillating needle on the meter. There was no denying it. He turned to the officials, trying to mask his excitement with measured calm. You see? It works, it's real. We can detect aircraft before they cross our coastlines, he said, voice firm despite the adrenaline surging through him. The room fell silent. Some officers leaned forward, squinting at the equipment, hesitant but intrigued. Others exchanged quiet murmurs. Bowen felt the tension like a live wire in the air, the line between disbelief and acceptance fraying ever so slightly. You understand? One older officer finally said, voice gruff, that if this works, it could change everything. But it's untested, unproven, entirely dependent on one man's calculations and a few makeshift devices. Yes, sir, Bowen replied. But every day we wait without trying, every day that passes without a chance to detect these aircraft is a day Britain becomes more vulnerable. I cannot guarantee perfection, but I can guarantee we can try, and that trying is better than doing nothing. A long pause followed. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of impending war pressing down. Bowen's chest ached with the uncertainty, the fear that his discovery might be dismissed too late. And yet, somewhere in that silence, a spark of recognition ignited in the minds of a few officers. Perhaps they realized this backyard experiment was more than the whim of a curious mind. Perhaps it was the first glimmer of hope. Bowen left the ministry that evening with cautious optimism. The city streets were damp from a sudden evening rain, the lamps casting golden reflections across puddles. He walked home quickly, each footstep echoing in the empty lanes. Somewhere over the Channel, invisible planes waited. Somewhere over Britain, time was slipping by. And he carried the knowledge that what he had discovered might be the difference between life and death for thousands. And yet, the question lingered like a shadow. Would the ministry act before it was too late? Bowen didn't have the answer. All he could do was keep proving, keep experimenting, and hope that a civilian's backyard trick could become the foundation of a nation's defense. The hum of the transmitter on his small farm awaited him, a constant reminder that the real work had only just begun. And as the night closed in, Bowen felt a mixture of dread and exhilaration, knowing that one impossible idea could either save Britain or see it fall. The early morning mist clung to the farm like a thin veil, blurring the fences and rows of winter wheat. Edward Bowen stood barefoot on the damp grass, wrapped in a threadbare coat, his breath puffing into the cold air. Around him, a strange assortment of wires, wooden poles, and metal scraps lay strewn across the field. To any passerby, it would have looked like a jumble of nonsense. But to Bowen, it was a battlefield, a place where invisible waves fought unseen, battles above the earth. He adjusted the transmitter once more. A contraption pieced together from scavenged parts, an old radio, coils of wire, a meter rescued from a discarded machine. Each night had brought small refinements, each day new observations. He had learned the quirks of the equipment, the way certain wires resisted current, how damp air affected the signal, even how the position of the moon and clouds could interfere with the readings. Every factor mattered. Tonight, he wasn't alone in his anticipation. Somewhere high above, a lone aircraft hummed through the sky, a willing participant in Bowen's daring experiment. The hum of the engine mixed with the low vibration of the transmitter, filling the field with a tense energy. Bowen crouched beside the receiver, notebook open, pencil poised to capture every flicker of movement on the needle. He sent out the first pulse. The needle jumped, a tiny twitch that made his heart lurch. He noted it carefully, adjusting the frequency and sending a second pulse. The needle jumped again, slightly stronger. He grinned, excitement coursing through him. This was no accident. There it was, undeniable and electrifying. The invisible waves he had sent into the sky had returned, carrying with them the trace of an object moving far above the earth, yet triumph was never simple. Bowen spent hours adjusting, recalibrating, and repeating the process. He discovered that rain scattered the waves, that the angle of the antenna could make the difference between detection and silence. Once, a stray cow wandered too close, its metal bell producing a false return that made him jump. But he learned, adapted, refined. Every challenge was a puzzle, every failure a lesson, and every success a tiny victory. As the nights turned into weeks, Bowen began to see patterns. The pulses returned faster as the aircraft approached and slower as it moved away. He could estimate altitude, track movement, and even distinguish between different sizes of planes. The backyard that had once been just an ordinary farm had become a laboratory, a place where science and instinct collided under the pale moonlight. The breakthrough came one evening in late October. A small biplane had been arranged to fly a series of passes over the field. Bowen, exhausted and shivering, sent out the signal and watched the needle swing. The first return came almost immediately, then another, and another, each one precise, each one unmistakable. He scribbled furiously in his notebook, hands trembling with adrenaline. The waves were consistent, reliable, and most importantly, they were working over a distance much greater than he had dared hope. For the first time, Bowen allowed himself to believe. He stepped back, eyes wide, watching the needle dance. This wasn't just a backyard trick anymore. It was a proof of concept, a method that could allow the detection of enemy aircraft long before they reached Britain's shores. The magnitude of it hit him like a physical blow. He was, in this quiet field, holding the potential to save thousands of lives, but with excitement came a sharp edge of fear. Bowen knew that what he was doing was more than science, it was a race against time. The Nazi threat was no longer theoretical. It was real, and each day that passed without a full-scale system in place meant that British cities remained vulnerable. The thought sent a chill down his spine, mingling with the exhilaration of discovery. Every pulse, every reflection from the sky, was a reminder of both promise and peril. The following weeks were a blur of repetition and refinement. Bowen experimented with different antenna heights, varying power outputs, and even rudimentary methods to filter out false signals. He documented every failure as meticulously as every success. Once, during a foggy night, the waves returned distorted, and he realized that temperature gradients in the air affected their speed. Another night, unexpected electrical interference from nearby towns nearly ruined a series of tests. Yet he persisted, driven by the certainty that each small step brought him closer to a solution that could protect a nation. Then, in a moment that seemed almost cinematic, it happened. Bowen watched the meter as a distant bomber, sent by a sympathetic pilot for testing, passed overhead. The signal returned clearly, distinctly, perfectly. He counted the pulses, compared them to his notes. and realized the truth. He could detect an aircraft at a distance, measure its approach, and predict its path. Bowen's eyes filled with tears, half from exhaustion, half from disbelief. He whispered to himself, voice trembling, "It works. It actually works." In that backyard, under the cold glow of the moon, Bowen allowed himself a rare smile. The field, the wires, the nights of solitude and struggle, all of it had led to this. A civilian, a man with no military rank, had uncovered a method that could give Britain an edge it had never dreamed of. The danger was real, the work far from over, but the proof was undeniable. He packed up the equipment as dawn crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. The ordinary farm had become extraordinary, a site where invisible signals met human ingenuity, where a man's curiosity might just tip the scales of history. And somewhere in the clouds above, the aircraft that had been his silent collaborator vanished into the morning light, leaving Bowen alone with his triumph. The awareness that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle, the streets of London, was slick with rain as Edward Bowen made his way through the labyrinth of the city, his notebook clutched tightly to his chest. Each step echoed off the stone walls of the ministry, a reminder of how far he had traveled from the quiet farm fields where his journey began. The city hummed with life and unease. Air raid warnings had begun to flicker on the edges of conversations, a constant reminder of the storm looming over Britain. Inside the ministry, the atmosphere was even more charged. Officers and clerks hurried along the corridors, papers clutched in their hands, faces tense with the weight of decisions that might mean the difference between victory and disaster. Bowen took a deep breath and stepped into the meeting room, where a panel of senior officials waited. Some faces were curious, others skeptical, and a few coldly indifferent. He began his presentation cautiously, setting down his equipment with the care of a surgeon. The transmitter and receiver, so familiar in his farm field, now looked alien under the bright fluorescent lights. "Gentlemen," he said, "what I have here is a method to detect aircraft before they reach our shores. The signals bounce off metal, return to the receiver, and give us an early warning minutes, possibly hours before visual sighting." The room was silent. One officer leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You're suggesting that a single device assembled in a backyard could outperform trained spotters and observers across the country?" "Yes, sir," Bowen replied. "Not just a single device, but a network. A system that could allow us to track multiple aircraft simultaneously. The implications for defense are enormous." For a long moment, the officers exchanged looks, some incredulous, others intrigued. Bowen could feel the tension like a physical presence, pressing against him from all sides. Weeks of backyard experiments had brought him here, to the threshold of recognition, but acceptance was still far from guaranteed. Then came the inevitable barrage of questions. "What about interference?" One officer asked sharply. "What if the equipment fails? How can we trust a civilian to lead this?" Bowen answered each carefully, citing his repeated tests, the consistency of the returns, and the growing body of data he had collected. Still, it was clear that the ministry was not fully convinced. Some officials saw his methods as unreliable, dependent on luck rather than science. Others worried that scaling up such an untested idea could waste precious time and resources. Weeks passed, filled with back-and-forth meetings, demonstrations, and technical discussions. Bowen found himself shuttling between his small farm, workshops, and the ministry, often working late into the night. Bureaucracy moved slowly, and each day brought new obstacles. Funding approvals were delayed, engineers were skeptical of his improvised methods, and the looming threat of war added urgency that made even minor delays feel catastrophic. Despite the challenges, there were small victories. A few forward-thinking officers began to see the potential. They requested more demonstrations, arranged for additional aircraft to participate in testing, and began sketching preliminary plans for a larger-scale implementation. Bowen worked tirelessly, refining the equipment, designing more robust receivers, and figuring out how to replicate his backyard experiments on a larger stage. One evening, as he returned to the ministry after a long day of testing, Bowen noticed a subtle change in the room. The officers who had once looked skeptical and distant now leaned forward with genuine interest. They asked detailed questions about the angles of the antennas, the strength of the signals, and the timing of the pulses. Bowen could see in their eyes that the idea was beginning to take root. The seed he had planted in his quiet field was germinating in the halls of power, yet the tension remained. Time was slipping away. Across the channel, reconnaissance planes had begun probing British defenses, and the threat of aerial attacks loomed ever larger. Bowen knew that every delay, every unanswered question, could cost lives. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, but it also fueled his determination. He pored over calculations, double-checked experiments, and worked closely with engineers to ensure that when the system was finally scaled up, it would function reliably. The breakthrough came gradually. After countless demonstrations, adjustments, and nights of exhaustion, the ministry agreed to fund a small network of experimental stations along the coast. Bowen oversaw the initial construction, teaching technicians how to assemble the receivers, calibrate the transmitters, and interpret the signals. The work was painstaking, each step a delicate balance between precision and improvisation. For Bowen, the moments of success were electrifying. Watching the first networked signals return from aircraft overhead, seeing technicians adjust dials in real time, he felt a surge of exhilaration. The backyard experiments had grown into something far larger, something that could change the course of the war, but the danger was far from over. Each day brought new technical challenges, storms interfering with signals, electrical faults in the equipment, and the constant need to synchronize multiple stations across miles of countryside. Bowen worked tirelessly to solve these problems, often losing sleep, driven by the knowledge that the system's reliability could mean the difference between life and death for thousands of civilians. As he walked back to his temporary lodgings one evening, the city darkened by looming clouds, Bowen reflected on the journey so far. The farm field, the makeshift experiments, the skepticism of the ministry, all of it had led to this moment. The network was beginning to take shape, the impossible idea becoming a tangible reality. Yet he knew the true test was still to come. The system would only prove its worth when Britain faced the skies full of enemy aircraft. And that day, he feared, was approaching faster than anyone dared imagine. Standing on the rain-slicked streets, Bowen looked up at the night sky. Somewhere above, unseen, the threat was waiting, but for the first time he felt a flicker of hope. His backyard trick, born of curiosity and determination, was on the verge of becoming Britain's shield. And though the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty, he knew he had taken the first critical step in turning an impossible idea into a weapon that could save a nation. The wind cut sharply across the English coastline as Edward Bowen stepped onto the rocky bluff overlooking the sea. The smell of salt and wet stone filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of generators and the creak of steel towers rising from the ground. This was no ordinary field, no backyard experiment. This was the future of Britain's defense, the beginnings of Chain Home. The first operational radar network. Bowen moved among the construction crews. Engineers and military personnel, each busy assembling massive steel towers, stringing miles of cable, and calibrating receivers. The machines were enormous compared to the modest equipment he had worked with in his farm field, yet the principles remained the same. Pulse by pulse, wave by wave, the idea he had nurtured in solitude was taking physical form along the coastline. A silent sentinel watching the skies, time was slipping through their fingers. Reports from the channel suggested that Nazi bombers were probing the coast, testing defenses, looking for weaknesses. Every hour, every delay in construction meant Britain's cities and civilians were exposed. Bowen felt the pressure keenly, pacing among the technicians, checking instruments, adjusting dials, offering guidance where his experience mattered most. "This needs to be precise," he called over the roar of the wind. "Every antenna, every pulse. If one fails, the signal won't reach the next station. We cannot afford errors?" An engineer looked at him with a mixture of respect and exhaustion. "We're doing everything we can, sir, but the storms keep knocking out alignment." It's a race against weather and time. Bowen nodded, the weight of the situation pressing on him. This was no longer a backyard trick. The lives of thousands, possibly millions, depended on these machines working flawlessly. He moved from tower to tower, checking the angles of antennas, the strength of transmitters, and the calibration of receivers. Every adjustment brought them closer to the goal, but the stakes made every minor error feel catastrophic. The first test came on a cold morning in late spring. A bomber, flying at high altitude, passed over the network. Engineers huddled around the meters, eyes wide with anticipation. Bowen's hands shook slightly as he adjusted the frequency, sending out the first pulse. Then, almost immediately, the signal returned clear, strong, and unmistakable. "It works," Bowen whispered, barely able to believe it. The meters confirmed it, a distant aircraft, detected before it was even visible to the naked eye. Cheers erupted among the crews, but Bowen barely smiled. There was no time for celebration. The enemy was real, the threat imminent. They had built the network. But the real test, when the Luftwaffe would sweep across the channel in force, was yet to come. In the following weeks, the chain-home network expanded rapidly. Stations dotted the coastline, each linked to the next by miles of cable and meticulously coordinated timing. Bowen oversaw every detail, from technical schematics to the training of operators who would interpret the signals. The work was exhausting, the nights long, but the urgency never allowed for rest. Every signal, every reflected pulse was a heartbeat in the defense of a nation. There were setbacks, of course. Storms damaged equipment, power fluctuations disrupted readings, and misaligned antennas occasionally produced false signals. Bowen tackled each problem relentlessly, often working side by side with engineers, climbing towers in gale force wanes, checking meters and recalibrating transmitters. The network had to be flawless. Anything less could cost lives. And then, one night, a message crackled over the rudimentary communications line, unidentified aircraft approaching from the channel. Operators scrambled to track the signal, and Bowen watched as the pulses painted a picture of the approaching threat on the instruments. For the first time, the network worked in a real-world scenario, detecting enemy aircraft. Long before any visual sighting could occur, Bowen's heart pounded as he relayed the information to command. Fighter squadrons were dispatched, guided by the signals he had helped create. The network he had envisioned, tested in his backyard, was now actively defending Britain's skies. Each plane intercepted, each bomb diverted, was a testament to the power of human ingenuity, determination, and the audacity of a single civilian's idea. Yet, even as victory surged within him, Bowen knew the work was far from over. The enemy would not wait, and the system had to grow faster, stronger, more reliable. More towers, more stations, more operators, the network had to become a living, breathing entity, ready to respond to threats at any hour. He pored over plans, coordinating with engineers and military officials, refining protocols, and ensuring that the chain of detection would never fail. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the towers cast long shadows across the fields, Bowen allowed himself a moment of reflection. From a quiet farm to skeptical officials to the windswept cliffs of the coast, the journey had been relentless. Yet the thought that his backyard experiments had grown into a network capable of saving the nation filled him with a deep, quiet pride. But even in that pride, the shadow of danger lingered. Over the channel, the Luftwaffe was preparing, probing the defenses he had helped build. Every pulse of the radar, every reflected signal, could mean the difference between life and death. Bowen understood that Britain's survival depended not just on the machines, but on the men and women operating them with courage and precision. The first full-scale drills of the chain-home network came weeks later. Aircraft were detected, tracked, and intercepted in real time. Bowen watched the data flow across instruments, each blip a signal of hope, each pulse a heartbeat of the nation. The system was working. Britain had, for the first time, a fighting chance against the skies full of enemy bombers, and as the night closed in, Bowen stood alone on the cliff, listening to the hum of transmitters and the soft crackle of communications lines. The wind tore through his coat, carrying with it the distant sound of the sea and the invisible threat beyond it. He knew that the network was more than metal and wires, it was a shield, a lifeline, and a testament to what one determined civilian could achieve. Chain Home had been born, rising from a backyard trick to a full-scale defense system, ready to watch over a nation on the brink. Bowen felt the weight of responsibility, the thrill of achievement, and the shadow of danger all at once. Britain was no longer blind to the skies, and in that realization, Bowen knew the world had changed forever. The first rays of dawn barely touched the English countryside when alarms rang out along the Chain Home network. Edward Bowen, now accustomed to the constant hum of transmitters and the low crackle of communications lines, stood among the controllers at one of the coastal stations. Every eye was fixed on the instruments, every hand poised to relay instructions. Somewhere above the clouds, the Luftwaffe was approaching, and Britain's skies held their breath. A pulse returned from a distant aircraft, then another and another in quick succession. The radar blips danced across the screens, revealing the precise locations and altitudes of incoming formations. Pilots in nearby airfields scrambled, engines roaring to life, as the information streamed from Bowen's network to the hands of men and women, whose courage would soon be tested. For Bowen, the sight was both exhilarating and terrifying. Each blip on the screen represented lives hanging in the balance planes, crews and civilians below, all dependent on the accuracy of these signals. He had spent countless nights perfecting this system, yet the stakes had never felt so real. The invisible waves he had nurtured in a quiet farm field now guided the fighters of a nation in its darkest hour. From the control room, Bowen could hear the frantic voices of operators calling out coordinates. 3 enemy bombers, heading southeast, altitude 12,000 feet. Another shouted. Fighters took off in formation, guided precisely to intercept, a ballet of courage choreographed by invisible pulses. Bowen's heart pounded in rhythm with the meter on his equipment. Each spike a message of hope or a warning of danger. In one small airfield, a young pilot named James Fletcher gripped the controls of his Spitfire, eyes scanning the sky even as his radio crackled with directions from the radar station. Enemy formation detected, bearing 075, the controller's voice said. Fletcher banked sharply, adrenaline surging, and caught sight of the German bombers silhouetted against the rising sun. He maneuvered carefully, trusting the guidance of men like Bowen, civilians whose curiosity had become a lifeline. Meanwhile, controllers worked with tense efficiency, interpreting signals, adjusting timing, and relaying data with split-second precision. Each accurate report allowed the RAF to position itself advantageously, to strike before the enemy could reach critical targets. The combination of human skill and technological innovation created a rhythm of defense that Britain had never known. Bowen felt a mix of awe and relief as the first engagements played out. Planes intercepted bombers before they could reach London. Coordinated strikes forced the enemy to retreat, and civilians below remained largely unaware of how close danger had come. Each success was a testament not only to his work, but to the bravery of everyone who had embraced it, from the engineers who built the stations to the pilots who risked their lives in the skies. Yet, the battle was far from over. Hours stretched into days, each attack testing the limits of both men and machines. Bowen moved from station to station, troubleshooting, observing, and learning, knowing that each pulse of radar was a heartbeat of defense. Every blip on the screen, every intercepted bomber, reinforced the reality that his backyard experiments had become a shield for an entire nation. As night fell and the airfields fell silent, Bowen allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. Britain had survived another day, not through luck alone, but through ingenuity, perseverance, and the courage of countless individuals working together. The invisible waves bouncing across the skies had become a symbol of hope, a quiet but powerful force standing between the enemy and the people below. And as he watched the lights of the coastal stations twinkle in the darkness, Bowen felt a deep, abiding pride. One man's curiosity, born in a farm field under the quiet night sky, had transformed into a tool that saved lives, guided heroes, and preserved a nation under siege. The Battle of Britain raged on. But for the first time, hope was tangible. Riding on invisible waves above the English Channel, the war had raged on for months. And Britain had survived the Blitz, battered but unbroken. Edward Bowen stood once more on the quiet farmland where his experiments had begun, the air crisp with the first chill of autumn. The wooden poles, wires, and makeshift equipment that had once been his entire laboratory were gone, replaced by memories and meticulous notes stored in neat boxes. To the casual eye, nothing remained. Yet Bowen knew better. Every pulse, every wave that had bounced off the sky, had become part of a vast network defending a nation, saving lives, and tipping the scales of history. Bowen's role, however, remained largely invisible. He did not appear on medals or in headlines, and few civilians knew his name. He was a quiet man, unassuming, preferring the company of calculations and circuits to public attention. And yet, his work had been monumental. The chain-home network, born from curiosity and a few nights of tinkering, had grown into the eyes and ears of Britain's defense, guiding pilots, protecting cities, and giving hope when all seemed lost. He walked along the edge of the field, fingers brushing the grass, recalling the nights he had spent huddled beside his improvised equipment, listening for the faintest return signal, heart racing with anticipation and fear. It had been a gamble, a quiet rebellion against skepticism and bureaucratic doubt, but the results had proven undeniable. What began as one man's experiment had become the cornerstone of a nation's survival. In London, radar operators and pilots continued to rely on the network Bowen had helped create. Letters of thanks from commanders and fleeting acknowledgments from military officials occasionally reached him, but nothing matched the satisfaction of knowing that his work had truly made a difference. Every intercepted bomber, every city that survived a raid, every life spared bore the invisible signature of his invention. Bowen often reflected on the nature of his contribution. He had not wielded a sword on the battlefield, nor piloted a plane into enemy formations. Yet, in the quiet way of the observer, the thinker, the engineer, he had shaped the course of events in ways that were profound and lasting. His backyard, once ordinary, had become the birthplace of ingenuity that Britain could not have done without a reminder that innovation often comes from the humblest beginnings. He thought of the young pilots, the brave controllers, and the engineers who had worked tirelessly to bring his vision to life. Their courage, their dedication, had turned the potential of his experiment into action and protection. And though history might remember the battles and the leaders, Bowen knew that the silent contributions of men and women like him were what truly kept the nation alive. Standing under the fading light, Bowen allowed himself a rare moment of pride. The winds of war still blew across the continent, and the future remained uncertain, but for now, Britain had endured. One civilian's curiosity, one man's relentless pursuit of an idea, had become a shield for millions. He looked up at the sky, now calm and vast above the farmland. Somewhere beyond the horizon, invisible aircraft still patrolled, threats that his system would continue to detect. Bowen felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his work would live on, guiding those who defended the skies long after he had returned to the simple rhythms of farm life. In the end, it was not fame or recognition that mattered. It was ingenuity, determination, and the courage to believe in an idea when no one else would. Edward Bowen had done just that, and in doing so, he had left a legacy that would ripple through history. A backyard experiment had become a lifeline. One man's curiosity had become a nation's shield. And in that quiet triumph, the world had changed forever.